There's a cedar box sitting in a barn in eastern Kentucky that most people would walk right past. Old hinges, weathered wood. Inside, a stack of handwritten ledgers going back to 1931. Column after column of hive numbers, dates, and weights. The man who found them was the original keeper's grandson. He'd been running bees for 20 years by then. He stood there in that barn and read through those numbers twice, because the first time he didn't believe them. 80 pounds, 84, 77, season after season, colony after colony, written in pencil, in a hand that didn't waver. No treatments listed, no sugar syrup, no pollen supplements, no record of anything being added to those hives at all. Just the bees, the forage, and something those old-timers understood that we've mostly stopped paying attention to. If you've kept bees for any length of time and you've ever wondered why your yields don't match what you feel like the colony is capable of, it might be worth staying with this one. If something here connects with what you've seen in your own yards, leave a comment below. And if this kind of content is useful to you, the subscribe button is there now. Back to those ledgers. The numbers themselves aren't the mystery. Bees can produce that kind of honey. Under the right conditions, a strong colony is capable of more than most of us ever see. The mystery is the consistency. Year after year, through drought years and hard winters, through the worst economic decade this country has ever lived through, these men were pulling reliable yields with nothing, no safety net, no inputs, and they couldn't afford to fail. That's not luck. That's a system. But here's what those records didn't say. They didn't list a single intervention, not one emergency feeding, not one treatment notation, not one supplement purchase, just the hive numbers and the weights. Which means whatever these men were doing, they were doing it before the season opened, not during it, not after. That changes the question entirely. Most of what modern beekeepers do is reactive. Something looks off, you respond. Colony seems light, you feed. Population drops, you treat. Flow starts, and you hope the colony is ready. That's not criticism. That's just how the information got passed down to us. We inherited a reactive model, and the reactive model produces reactive results. Inconsistent weights, colonies that are strong in April and exhausted by July, years where the honey comes in and years where it doesn't, and you're never quite sure which one you're going to get. These Depression-era beekeepers didn't have the option of being reactive. If a colony failed, there was no quick purchase to replace it. If a season came in light, that was a real loss, not an inconvenience. So they learned to watch. Not to intervene, to watch. And what they watched more carefully than almost anything else was the brood nest in early spring. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. A honeybee colony is not a single organism. It behaves like one, but it's actually a continuous biological negotiation between three overlapping populations: the queen's laying rate, the nurse bees caring for brood, and the foragers working the field. These three groups are always in tension with each other. Resources that go toward brood rearing don't go toward honey storage. Bees that are nursing can't forage. The colony is always making a trade-off, and that trade-off is driven by timing. Most beekeepers today would look at a colony in early April. Brood nest expanding fast, bees clustering tight around the frames, consumption high, and reach for a feeder, get them built up, help them along. That instinct comes from a good place. But it was exactly the wrong move, and those old ledgers prove it, even if they don't explain it in so many words. When you feed a colony that is naturally pacing its spring buildup, you don't accelerate the right thing. You accelerate brood production ahead of the colony's ability to regulate hive temperature, ahead of the nurse bee population that exists to cover that brood, and, critically, ahead of the local forage calendar. You push the population curve forward, and then the nectar flow opens, and the colony is buried in brood it still needs to hatch and warm and feed, with foragers tied up on nursing duty instead of in the field. The hive looks full of bees. It is full of bees, but it's the wrong kind of full at the wrong time. The Depression-era keepers weren't smarter than modern beekeepers. They were just poorer. They couldn't afford to feed, so they didn't. And without that interference, the colony's own biological calendar ran correctly. Brood built at the pace the colony could support. The nurse population and the forager population matured in sequence. And when the tulip poplar opened, or the locust came in, or the clover started, the hive had foragers, not nurses. Foragers. The answer wasn't in the bees. It was in the calendar. There's an old phrase you still hear from some of the longer-running beekeepers in the Appalachian region. They call it reading the brood. Not inspecting it, not managing it, reading it. The way you read weather, the way you read a field, looking at the brood nest not to find problems, but to understand where the colony is in its own natural cycle. What they were reading for, though they didn't use this language, was the ratio of capped brood to open brood in relation to the expected flow date. A brood frame capped today will hatch in roughly 12 days. Those newly emerged bees will spend the first 3 weeks of their lives as nurse bees. Then they'll shift to foraging. So the bees that are capped in your frames right now, that's your forager population for roughly 5 weeks from today. If your major nectar flow opens in 5 weeks, and your brood nest is building at the right pace, those bees will be in the field exactly when you need them. If you've been feeding and your brood nest is running 2 weeks ahead of that curve, those same bees peaked and shifted before the flow arrived. They're aging out just as the nectar comes in. And this is the part that gets missed every season by almost everyone. You don't see it happen. It doesn't announce itself. The colony looks strong, the boxes look active, and then the flow closes and you pull the supers and the weight isn't there, and you spend the rest of the fall wondering what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The timing was off. By 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. 10 days doesn't sound like much. But in a colony running at full capacity during a nectar flow, 10 days of peak forager presence is the difference between a deep super that's 2/3 full and one that's packed solid. That's the gap in the ledger. That's where the 80 pounds comes from. Or doesn't. They weren't managing colonies. They were managing timing, the specific sequence these men used. And you can piece it together from the old literature, from the agricultural bulletins of the 1930s, from beekeeping correspondence that survives in state archive collections. Wasn't complicated, but it required patience. And it required trusting the biology over the anxiety of looking at a light cluster in February and wanting to do something about it. The sequence ran roughly like this. In late winter, no interference. Let the colony break cluster on its own schedule. The queen will begin laying when the internal conditions of the hive tell her to, not when the calendar says February is over. Supplemental feeding at this stage teaches the colony's internal signals to ignore what the hive actually needs and respond instead to an artificial stimulus. The brood nest expands prematurely. The cycle starts wrong in early spring, and the definition of early spring here is biological, not calendar-based. The first indicator these men watched for was drone brood, not worker brood expansion. Drone brood. The appearance of drone brood in the lower frames of a healthy colony is a signal that the colony's own assessment of the coming season is optimistic. It's committing reproductive resources. That's the first green light. The second indicator was propolis activity at the upper entrance and around the inner cover. A colony beginning to seal itself against drafts while simultaneously expanding the brood nest is a colony that has made its internal calculations and decided conditions are right. It's not struggling, it's preparing. When those two signals appeared together, drone brood in the lower frames, propolis sealing at the top, these men left the hive alone. No inspection, no feeding, no manipulation of any kind. The colony was running its own program. Interference at that stage interrupts the program. The third and final element of the sequence was swarm pressure management, not swarm prevention in the modern sense, not adding boxes early, not splitting preemptively based on a schedule. Swarm pressure reading, watching for the biological signals that the colony was approaching its critical population threshold. Queen cells appearing on the bottoms of frames. Foragers clustering on the outside of the lower box on warm mornings, a particular restlessness in the population that experienced beekeepers recognize before they can fully articulate it. When those signals appeared, a specific intervention was made, and it was one intervention, not several. A single brood frame, pulled from the congested part of the nest and placed at the edge of the brooding area, with an empty drawn comb placed in its center. This didn't split the colony. It didn't disrupt the queen. It relieved the pressure in exactly the location where the colony felt it most, the center of the brood nest, and it gave the population room to expand without triggering the swarming sequence. One frame, one comb, one movement. That's it. That's the whole active management component of an approach that produced consistent 80-pound yields through the worst decade in American agricultural history. There's one more piece to this, and it's the piece that makes the rest of it work. These men knew their forage, not in a general sense, not "there's clover around." They knew which fields, which hollows, which hillsides bloomed when, and in what sequence. They knew that the serviceberry came 2 weeks before the locust, and the locust ran for 10 days, and after the locust there was a gap before the clover opened. They placed their hives accordingly, not for maximum proximity to a single source, but for sequential access to multiple flows, a colony positioned to hit serviceberry, then locust, then clover in sequence, with the brood timing aligned to peak forager population during the locust and clover, was a different animal than a colony sitting next to one strong clover field waiting for one window. The diversity of the forage extended the period of maximum production. The colony didn't peak and crash. It built, held, and built again. That's not something you can manufacture with supplements. You can't feed your way to that. The forage has to exist, and you have to know it well enough to position for it. Modern beekeeping has moved toward management, toward inputs, toward control. Some of that has been necessary. Varroa changed the equation in ways those Depression-era beekeepers never had to account for. That's real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the drift away from biological timing, away from forage knowledge, away from reading the colony's own signals, that drift happened before Varroa. It happened because inputs became available. And available inputs are hard to leave on the shelf when a colony looks like it needs help. The man in that Kentucky barn eventually started keeping records of his own. Same format as his grandfather's. Colony number, date, weight. He started leaving the feeders in the shed, started watching for drone brood before he opened a single hive, started learning his own forage calendar the way those old men knew theirs. He told me it took 3 seasons before the numbers started moving. Not because the method was slow, because he was. He kept second-guessing it, kept reaching for the feeder when a cluster looked light, kept adding boxes too early. The method isn't complicated. Trusting it is. By the 4th year, his ledger had a number in it he'd never written before. 81 pounds. The knowledge wasn't lost. It was just sitting in a cedar box in a barn, waiting for someone to read it carefully enough. If any of this lines up with what you've seen in your own operation, or if it contradicts something you've been doing for years and you want to push back on it, the comment section is the right place for that. This kind of conversation is worth having. And if you found something useful here, a like helps this reach the people who are asking the same questions. The brood nest doesn't lie. It never has. The question is whether we're paying close enough attention to hear what it's saying.